One of Leonard Cohen's best-known songs is So Long, Marianne, but not a lot of people know about the real Marianne who inspired it. There is a new TV show all about that relationship. Today, So Long, Marianne, a show that challenges how we think about the muse. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This is Commotion. All right, I think the natural place for us to get things started is here.
Now so long, Marianne, it's time that we began to lie and cry and laugh about it all again.
Look, it's a majestic song. That is Leonard Cohen. That is So Long, Marianne. Look, if you create a show based on one of Leonard's most beautiful, iconic songs, I think you just naturally have a very, very high bar to meet. Let me tell you, So Long, Marianne, the new series on Crave that attempts to meet this bar, is here now. It tells the story of Leonard Cohen's relationship with Marianne Ilhen in Greece in the early 60s. It is a Norwegian-Canadian co-production, and it is as much Leonard Cohen's story as it is Marianne's. Brian D. Johnson is here. Teri Hart is here. They've both seen the first two episodes, which are available right now on Crave. Oh my God, Teri and Brian, welcome to the show, guys. How's it going?
Hey.
Hello.
How are you?
Hey.
Hi, Elamin.
I'm delighted
nice to meet you.
Likewise. I'm so delighted that you're both here. Brian, I'm going to start with you, man. Like, you got to know Leonard Cohen pretty well over the years. Talk to me about this chapter of his life that this series is going to show us. What's going on here?
Well, Leonard is 25, living in Montreal, a bit of a struggling poet, as all poets are. Mm-hmm. So he does what poets did back in the day. He got a Canada Council grant and flew off to Europe for inspiration and ended up in London,
Sure.
Where all he found was a lot of rain and fog. And then he, on a whim, he saw a travel poster or something. He said, oh, Hydra or Hydra. In this Greek island, why don't I go there? He ended up there. There's a little writer's colony there. So he made himself at home right away, being whisked into bed by basically the first woman he meets right off the boat, who is not Marianne. He sort of has a stopgap kind of relationship with a writer, a married writer, older woman. But Marianne is in the corner of his eye for the first two episodes. I mean, this is a slow burn. They don't really they don't kiss until the third episode. So and it's an 8-episode series.
Spoiler alert, Brian, but yeah.
Well, sorry, it's a true story. What can I say? But anyway, they end up together for about 8 years or so. So and the 8 episodes track that relationship as much from her point of view as his, which is really interesting because it's always been a bit lopsided in the narratives that have preceded this.
I'm going to come back to that idea of it being lopsided in the narratives that preceded this because I think that is kind of central to this conversation here. But to just keep it maybe focused on the show for a moment, Brian, as you were watching this, was there a moment where you're like, oh, Leonard would like this? Like Leonard would really like the way that this is being shown?
I've only seen the first 2 episodes, and to tell you the truth, I had trouble watching it because I was so nervous that it would not be right.
Yeah.
So I watched it again, and but the first time through, I've got to say, the place where my heart connected to it was the first music cue, which was a needle drop. It was Leonard's own voice, but it was a very unlikely and clever needle drop. It was the song "What Happens to the Heart," which is from his posthumous album.
That's from the last record. Yeah.
His last record. And I immediately thought, oh, these guys know what they're doing. You know, these guys understand Leonard. And to put the Leonard on his deathbed virtually, his voice there, it was like, oh, Leonard had entered the room as far as I was concerned. He was there. And that made a big difference. And then I guess the other point is where Alex Wolff,
he plays Leonard in the...
Yeah, who is a musician and an actor, fortunately. Fortunately, he's also a musician. But when he first picks up the guitar and starts to strum the Stranger song, I thought, oh, yeah, this guy's got it. It's...
But I gotta say, like, if I made the show and I just heard somebody who knew Leonard personally say it was like Leonard entered the room, I don't think there's higher praise. I don't think there can be higher praise than that. Teri, I'm gonna kick it over to you. As you're watching the show, This is a show that is about Leonard's story as much as it is Marianne's. Tell us about the way that it treats Marianne's story. What does this show help us understand about her?
Well, a lot of, I mean, what you guys have just alluded to in the first two episodes, it's actually more Marianne's story than Leonard's story, and I love that. For my whole life, I've been watching stories about artists and the women who have inspired them, and it's all about the man.
Yeah.
And so it's really nice to be focused squarely on this incredible woman who, left her life and went to Hydra, and she was not a musician. She was not a poet. She was not a writer, but she was surrounded by all these people. And with her new husband, who is the worst man, Axel is the worst man. And we find her negotiating, understanding who she's married and what that means for her life. And she is not paying any attention to other men. She is not looking particularly in any way at Leonard Cohen. She's squarely focused on what this means for her life and understanding the marriage that she's in as she becomes a mother as well. She's not just an object. She's forging a life ahead for herself. And she really fought for how she should be treated. And I think that, starting this 8-part series out with a really square understanding of who Marianne was as a person, not just an object, really felt right to me.
Okay, so that's where I wanted to root this discussion, the idea of Marianne not being an object, because I think we're relatively familiar with the notion of the muse as a vehicle for us to get to know the artist. The muse is rarely three-dimensional, right? Like what we get is, the muse is only as real as the artist needs her. It's usually a woman, and the artist is usually a man, kind of mining her for parts, if you will. Like the way that these sort of stories get created in popular culture, it tends to be the case that the muses get more and more two-dimensional as the central artist kind of becomes more of the central fascination of the story. I would say, Brian, like Marianne was famous for being this muse, which is like, as a concept comes with all of this baggage that I just mentioned, because the muse tends to have no agency. They are just this object. Brian, you got to know Leonard as someone who's had a different kind of relationship with the women who inspired him. He didn't see them in that way. How so? What was his relationship to the women who inspired him?
Well, a muse is a simplification, really. It's a romantic notion, and Leonard was never that simple. And I mean, he had many relationships with many women on all kinds of different levels, some of whom operated perhaps as muses briefly, some for a long time. But there was an equilibrium that he had with women, and I think it's because he worshipped women and they worshipped him. It was a kind of, it was a worship that was mutual, and secular, and respectful. And the amazing thing is, after all of the casual and not so casual romances and trysts that Leonard's had over the course of his life, he seemed to have survived the Me Too movement without a scratch. You never hear a discouraging word. I mean, I'm sure he'd be the first to admit that, he did bad things and he was not a perfect guy by any means. But I mean, in some of his muses, like Sharon Robinson, was a lifelong collaborator and singer-songwriter who co-wrote Everybody Knows, one of his most famous songs, Waiting for the Miracle, and a whole bunch of other songs. And Anjani Thomas, who was maybe his last muse, and I use that word kind of in inverted commas because it's not really true. That was his last longtime partner. And she recorded 2 albums with him. And that was the period when I really got to know Leonard and spent time with them. And would sit around, singing Irish folk songs with them as we got drunk, kind of thing. And this was like a pal, I mean, he didn't turn his muses into wives. And even Marianne, I mean, he kind of, sampled fatherhood for the first time with Marianne's kid from her husband. And of course, Marianne was an experienced muse because her husband basically treated her as his typist, his proofreader, his cook, his maid, his wife. And I think going to Leonard after that kind of treatment must have been heavenly, because it was much more having a real equal companion.
Teri, you just took this sharp inhale as you as Brian just sort of talked about the way that her husband as the way that like Marianne's husband sort of treated her in the story. What was going on there just now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to remember that this was the 60s and it was the bohemian kind of hippie free love movement that was taking shape. And the invention of the birth control pill really gave women a sexual freedom that they'd never had before. So we talk about men in this way and of this time, but there was also a real kind of possibility for women and their own agency and their own experiences that they'd never had before. But Brian said how famous Leonard Cohen is, not only for his art, but also for the women that he romanced. And, the analysis of Leonard Cohen and his romantic trysts is extensive, and it's not always flattering. Of course, yes, he escaped any, responsibility around the Me Too movement for sure. But there was a Nick Broomfield documentary in 2020, Marianne and Leonard Words of Love. And that was really an indictment of Leonard Cohen's behavior. So, we've only seen the first 2 episodes of So Long, Marianne. We don't know where they're going to take this story, if it's going to stay in this kind of sweet, loving, Leonard Cohen and Marianne Ilhen were muses for each other in some way, or if it's going to take a darker turn, because I think there was some darkness around their relationship and around him as a womanizer, as a person who really loved the company of not just one, but many women.
I'll also just say, go ahead, Brian. Go ahead.
I was going to say he'd be the first to admit that. I think there's a bit in that in those first 2 episodes that gave me hope, which is when he's ending his affair with the first woman he meets on the island, the older married woman. He says, this was an amazing line, and the way Alex Wolff delivered it, he said, "I very much want to rip your clothes off with my teeth, but I think the curtain has gone down on this show." And
I wrote it down, Brian. I wrote that line
down. A very Leonard line?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, how diplomatic, yet that glint of steel beneath the silk. Yeah. And Leonard was incredibly selfish in a lot of ways. I remember Jackie Burroughs, an old friend of ours, she sort of had a one-night thing with Leonard in a hotel room, I think, in New York. And she was awake in the middle of the night, and he sort of slunk off in the middle of the night. And she looked up and said, "Oh, what's going on?" He said, "I'm a poet. I have to leave." So he had his priorities, he had his priorities. It was always on Leonard's terms.
I will say...
he was honest about that, though.
I will say that it would be a missed opportunity. I mean, we've only seen the first 2 episodes of this series. It would be a missed opportunity if this show didn't also explore some of the side effects of living that lifestyle, Teri. It would sort of be doing the whole story a significant disservice if it was just sort of sat comfortably in the romanticization, right?
Yeah, I mean, we see the darkness of Leonard Cohen's life. We see his depression. We see his drug and alcohol use. We see so we have to also see the effects of these choices of I'm a poet before anything else, on the people who he spends time and romance and emotion with.
Sure. Brian, we should point out that, if you come to the show expecting to hear Leonard singing, that's not what you're going to get. The songs are performed entirely by Alex Wolff. He's both an actor and a musician, as you mentioned. His band is opening for Billie Eilish tonight in Toronto, which is really exciting. What do you think of his renditions, of his attempts to do Leonard in the show?
Well, I've only seen the one song in those first 2 episodes, the Stranger song. And he was playing it, I think, with the appropriate level of shyness and tentativeness that he would at this stage in his career. And he probably hadn't even written that song that early on Hydra, but that's a permissible license. But I thought he was really good. He does the same thing in his singing in that song as he does in his performance, which there's a subtlety, there's a nuance, there's a vulnerability, a tenderness, yet an authority. And Leonard, he mixed complete abject humility with supreme confidence like nobody I've ever met. I mean, it's kind of a trick almost. It's, and he was very good at doing it on stage, and he was very good at doing it in person. But the thing is, whether he was one-on-one or in front of an arena full of people. He had a special relationship with the person he's talking to that makes you feel like, yeah, he's really talking to me, and it's special. He was a master of expressing intimacy, and I guess his most famous song, Hallelujah, is, and Leonard was a flawed singer. So the challenge with doing Leonard is not to do him too well. I mean, if you're singing,
singer.
he's not. He reveled in the imperfections of his own voice.
Teri, last word to you, just on the performances as you watch the show. What's staying with you?
That scene that Brian recounts in episode 2 of him singing the Stranger song, all of his friends and a couple lovers are sitting around the table, and they're all just kind of, almost slack-jawed watching him perform this song. And that's how I felt. I mean, I felt slack-jawed watching it. I just thought that he was perfect. He was perfect with his voice. He was perfect in his guitar playing. And if that's what we're going to see for the 8 episodes of Alex Wolff, then my goodness, line up the awards, because it's going to be a heck of a performance for the next, and I can't wait for it. I'm really interested to see where they go. I'm really interested to see how truthful they get to him. And I love the fact that it's a Norway Canadian co-production, so it feels very, very Scandinavian. It doesn't feel Hollywood, and that works for the poetry of Leonard Cohen incredibly well, I think.
I gotta say, I'm curious about the 3 of us checking in after the show wraps up. It is episodic release, so it's gonna be over in about 5 weeks or so. In the meantime, we gotta leave it there. Brian, Teri, this has been a delight. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Elamin.
Of course.
Bye.
Talk soon.
Nice
Bye,
to
folks.
see you. Bye.
Brian D. Johnson is a filmmaker and critic. Teri Hart is an entertainment reporter and a regular right here on Commotion. So Long Marianne, by the way, is on Crave. New episodes drop every Friday. All right, we are now going to switch gears to another story that also deals with music. I'm Elamin Abdul Mahmood. This is Commotion. That is Vancouver's Karen Ajala and Listen and Icky performing at the Junos earlier this year. Karen won the TikTok Fan Choice Award that night, and then he kind of has become the face, I think, of a growing force of South Asian Canadian artists dominating the music charts abroad and racking up millions and millions and millions of streams. I'm talking about Karen because the Junos have just added a new award to the roster for the next year. It's called the South Asian Music Recording of the Year. Jeevan Sangha is a culture critic in Surrey, BC. She's here to talk about this new prize. Jeevan, welcome to the show, friend.
Hi.
Hi.
Great to be here.
I'm so happy that you're here. Look, how did you feel when you heard, the Junos are going to add this category, this South Asian Music Recording of the Year category?
I think it brought up a lot of emotions for me. I think the first thing is just, wow, that's so cool. Like, this is really exciting. South Asian artists have been out here. I mean, South Asian, I use like big air quotes around because like, what does that mean? But I think it's exciting. It's cool. I'd love to see also, the recognition on a very Canadian award show that's showing that this is Canadian music. I think that means a lot, especially at this cultural moment in time. At the same time, it also raised some questions for me about, what role is this award going to play in the grand scheme of the Junos? Will it be televised? Is this going to be, is this going to hinder those same artists from being considered in, let's say, a pop category, and it reminds me a lot of a very different conversation sparked by Tyler, the Creator, a few years ago, where he was critical of the term urban for very problematic and obvious reasons why the term urban was used. And he actually won the category. But he said something really interesting that I think can be applied here, which was, anytime Black artists are making something that's genre bending or different, we get put in like urban or like rap categories when that's not necessarily what they are. And I wonder, like, why can't we just be pop? Was something that he said that I thought was really interesting. And some of that I think came to mind here too, which was the numbers don't lie with Punjabi artists specifically. Like, there are some crazy metrics, billions of streams cumulatively. So why can't we be pop?
Well, okay, but let me ask you this, because you said in your answer a couple of things I want to pick up on. One is the idea of air quotes around the category name. That's important. That's important to talk about because if you're going to introduce a new category, you don't want to be immediately sort of at odds with the people in the community. So when you hear the idea of South Asian Recording of the Year, does that immediately kind of go like, actually, you don't quite get the scene? Like, does that immediately make you go, that feels a little bit outside of it, because you've been covering Punjabi hip hop and the rise of it for a minute. Like people are catching up now, but you're like, I've been here. Like we've all kind of been here for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, I just think South Asian is a pretty controversial term within the community as well. Like people are very validly critical of it because, I mean, South Asian is not a language, nor is it a genre, right? It's just a term used to describe an entire subcontinent.
It's a broad regional category. Yeah.
A very broad regional category. A lot of the other categories at the Juno Awards don't use a qualifier like that.
Yeah.
So it can feel weird. It can feel a little bit strange, especially when it feels like, I mean, if you look at the last few years of the Juno Awards, they seem to be kind of making a concerted effort to include Punjabi language programming specifically. I mean, thinking about 2022, Tesher performed Bhangra on stage with Simu Liu, and it was this like huge viral moment.
Yeah.
And then you had AP Dillon last year performing this like rock star performance, and Karan Aujla this year, like you mentioned. So if it's being driven by Punjabi music, it feels weird to have the South Asian term. I understand its utility in terms of opening a door for more people and more communities, and I'm all for that.
What are the pitfalls? Like,
Just,
what are the pitfalls of like using that term, do you think, as a category? Like, what happens if you get too broad?
well, I think it reinforces the idea that like the entire subcontinent is the same, and all these like very specific regional communities and ethno-religious identities are the same. There are comparisons to be drawn, but they're not the same. They each exist at very different intersections and experience their cultures very, very differently. But also I think about like, you know, the Juno Awards from my understanding is, you know, it's in part artists submitting, but it's also committees that help make that decision. And how do you create a committee that's reflective of the ethno diversity and linguistic diversity of an entire subcontinent so that the awards aren't just being given to the same region or the same place time and time again? How do we make sure it's really a quote unquote South Asian music recording of the year?
I think there's a sort of a fine balance to be struck between like, hey, we're celebrating that you're finally catching up, you know, to this wave of artists who have been getting millions and billions of streams, and they finally sort of have a place to be recognized. But also, how do you draw the boundaries around that place for that celebration? I should say, like, the growth in the music has been really community driven, right? Like, it grew to become this global force. How much support has it gotten? How much support has quote unquote South Asian music gotten from the music industry in Canada, from places like the Junos? Like, are they playing catch up, or have they kind of been there from the ground floor, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think to their credit, they've been putting in the work for the last few years.
Okay.
Like I said, from like 2022 to my knowledge, I think the mainstream always takes some time to catch up.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I mean, AP Dillon is one of those like great examples. He's like in his Amazon documentary, he talks about kind of like going from like nobody to one of the biggest Punjabi stars in the world, just like a group of guys in his basement. And even when they did their first show at Rogers, it was just like a group of friends really trying to make it happen. They chronicle the sort of challenges that they faced because they didn't have the insider knowledge, I guess.
But when you say Rogers, you mean a stadium, though, right? Like,
Rogers Arena in Vancouver, which is one of the largest venues.
Yeah, it feels odd for like the industry not to be there early on when like you're like trying to put on a stadium show. Like the demand is there,
for
right?
Sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Like Karan Aujla just did a sold out show in Vancouver, and it was the highest sold Punjabi show at the venue. It's amazing. I mean, recently we're seeing a shift, like Warner 91 North, for example. There's a joint venture that was launched between Warner Music Canada and Warner Music India to foster South Asian Canadian talent. There's also, I mean, recently AP Dillon signed with Republic Records, which is a big deal, in alliance with Universal Music Canada. Like, these are big steps that are enabling artists to dream bigger. I mean, AP's last project had a song with Arya Starr, like an Afrobeats banger, a song with Gunna. You know, it's cool stuff, a rock song. Like, it's cool to see the genre bending stuff coming out of Punjabi music. I think it usually takes the mainstream a little bit of time to catch on, but I think they see it a little bit better now because it's more profitable than it's ever been before.
I think that's real. I think that's also a good place to leave it. Jeevan, I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course, anytime. Jeevan Sangha is a writer and editor, has written for Billboard Canada, The Tyee, and CBC Music. She's in Surrey, BC. And that is it for the podcast today. My name is Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion. You can find us on Instagram. We are at Commotion CBC. You can find us on YouTube. I'm going to see you tomorrow. So if you're going to be here, I'll see you then.